look at chapter 12, verse 13 is where we'll begin. As I began preparing the message here, there was about 3 of them out of this chapter that I wanted to share with you. And then as I continued to study and look at what Jesus was saying, became very aware of the fact of how all this ties together. And when we split it up, sometimes we don't get the full impact of what Jesus is trying to teach us. So instead of doing 3 sermons, which lengthwise may be that long, Jim, he said better not. But no, we're going to look at how all this ties together. It is amazing when we study the Bible, how through the first time that we may grasp some truth there, but as we continue to look at it, how Jesus just goes deeper and deeper and far greater reaching what he's attempting to teach us. We're going to be familiar with 2 of the sections here that we're going to look at. And I hope that we can, that I can tie them together in a way that we will understand. If you would read with me, beginning in verse 13 of Luke chapter 12. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will give what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God." We'll stop there, as Jesus, first of all, is going to tell us 3 ways not to live. And then finally, at the end of the message here, he's going to tell us how we are to live. And the first thing that he shared with us is that we are not to live life as acquisitions. That's not to be the goal of our life, to live a life of gaining these things. Peter Marshall, I think I have a picture up here. He was a chaplain at Congress for many, many years and was a very wise man. And he had a gentleman that he had known from years before. And this gentleman came to him years later and told him that he was having a problem. And Peter Marshall said, "What is it? What's your problem?" He said, "Well, when I lived here in the city, I made $500 a week. And I tithe. I gave $50 a week to the Lord. Now I'm a millionaire, and I find that I can't tithe as a millionaire." And Peter Marshall said, "Well, let's pray." So the man agreed, and Peter Marshall prayed. He said, "God, please reduce this man's income down to where he can tithe again." Not quite what the guy was thinking, okay? But we are not to live a life of acquisition. That Jesus wants us to understand that, and what is going on here, he's talking in the first part of chapter 12 about pretense, about being honest with God, what I shared with you last week. And then in the middle of this, in verse 13 it is, this guy evidently has an argument with his brother. And he says to Jesus, "Make him divide the inheritance with me." And what does Jesus' reply is, "It's not my job. That's not what I'm here for. I'm not the judge. I'm not the one that decides." But you see, what Jesus is aware of is there's a far greater problem here than the inheritance. There's a far greater problem than just dividing up what this man's parents left for him and his brother. The problem is of mixed up, confused priorities. And that's the key here that Jesus is going to address for us. That what happens is with this farmer, and I think we all are kind of familiar with this, there is no indication in this that the farmer was dishonest. There's no indication at all that he was doing anything wrong. God had blessed him. And there's the first problem that he has is that he takes credit for what God has done. And that's the beginning of his downfall. But he looks around, he's got all these crops, he doesn't know what he's going to do with them, so he decides that he will build bigger barns to store all this in, and then he can just sit back, relax, and enjoy life. Guys, that sounds like the American dream, doesn't it? That we get a job, we work hard, we save money, so that when we retire, we're going to have plenty of money to live on and do the things we like. Now, the problem with that, folks, is that Jesus appears and says what? You fool. Well, wait a minute. Isn't that what everybody does? And Jesus says, you fool. You fool. See, in the midst of all of this, that his priorities are confused, and he finds himself, not only has he left God out of the picture, he finds himself in conflict with what God says in Christ. And there's the key to this that we have to look at. Am I saying that we're not supposed to plan and save for the future? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we're not supposed to live for the future. That we are to live to fulfill God's plan. It was John Wesley, I think, that said that he had no problem with growing old because so many people never have the chance. We don't know how long we're going to live. We don't know what is before us, and Jesus wants us to keep our priorities correct. That if I continue the direction, and so many people are, of this farmer, I'm going to find myself in conflict with what God wants for my life. And I don't care what else we do, if we are not living out what God's plan for me is, then what? And God looks at us and says, you fool. You left out the most important part. That in the world you look like you're very successful, but in reality you've missed the whole boat. What kind of life do we want? You know, I have this discussion with my 3 sons all the time, okay? Because I'm just trying to keep them on track. Because they will say to me, Dad, all we want is to be comfortable. We don't want to be real rich. We want to be comfortable. And my question is continually, what is that? What is comfortable? Because you see, the line between comfortable and coveting is very, very thin. Very thin. We want to be comfortable. What does that mean? Okay? That when our finances increase, then our standard of living increases. And we find ourselves in the same spot we were before then. And Jesus doesn't want that. It's something that, well, it's something that is a great danger to all of us, folks. There's no doubt. Okay? Do you realize that Jesus speaks about money and possessions 7 times more often than heaven and hell? Because he knows the temptation. He knows the danger that is there, because we will not just deliberately step out of God's plan, but just gradually we find ourselves drifting away. How many of you took biology in high school? How many of you flunked it? Just checking. Okay. Did you do the experiment with the frogs in the hot water? How many of you did that? Okay. We must have gone to school a long time ago. You take a pan of boiling water and you put the frog in that pan. What does the frog do? It jumps out. But if you put that same frog in a pan of cool water and turn the fire on underneath it, gradually turning it up, that frog just kind of sits there and just drifts off, and that's it. Okay? We can do the same. You see, Jesus understands the danger here, and not just with possessions. You know, you're going to say, well, Joe doesn't think we should have all. That's not what this is about. This is about priorities. This is about getting our mind straight to where God wants us to be and what God wants us to do. If we have the, that is, I will tell you that's a picture of. But any resemblance to anyone in the church, completely coincidental. This is what I want to show you. These guys are adrift at sea. And because you're out there and you're in the sun and all the elements, one of the greatest desires that you have is to reach over and get a hand of water and drink it. But the problem is what? Salt water. Okay? So what does the salt water do? It makes you thirstier. So then you have the tendency to get more, and you get more, and it gets you thirstier and thirstier, and in the process, what's it doing? It's killing you, it's dehydrating you, you're going to die if you keep drinking that. That's what possessions do to us. That we are physical, material people, and we need these physical things, we think, Jesus says that we need food, shelter, and clothing, okay? But folks, he never said we need the best food. He never said we need the best clothes. He never said we need the best house. He said God's going to provide that. How's he going to provide it? What's our part in that? Do you remember? Matthew 6. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. That's a promise. And if I seek his kingdom and my priorities are correct, then he's going to supply those things that I need. So what happens is, with possessions, folks, we're all in danger of that. We all need to really watch our view of these things because it sucks us in, and we're not even aware of it. It's not that we deliberately look at God and shake our fist and I'm going to do whatever I want to do, but the tendency is there for us to do. How many of you can remember the dumbest mistake you ever made? How many of you are going to tell us what it is? There's a bank teller or a bank card that will tell you the dumbest mistake he ever made. He lives in Boise, Idaho, and mistakenly picked up a pouch of $3.5 million and put it in the paper shredder. Checks, cash that were not recorded anywhere. The bank had no idea what all was in that bag that he had shredded. So they had to hire 30 new employees to sit there every day and put the strips of paper back together so they could get all their records straightened out. Now that probably would classify as one of the dumbest things somebody ever made. Okay? I can tell you some others. We won't go. You know, they have an award they give every year to someone that does the stupidest thing, and they record. Not all of them are funny. Some of them are. Some of them are very, very deadly. The two men from the gas company in Connecticut, I think it was, that were looking for a leak in this building, and their flashlight went out, and one of them lit his cigarette lighter to see. They were both killed instantly, of course, in the explosion, and just things like that. Well, what Jesus does not want us to do is to make that mistake the farmer made. Was that the biggest mistake the farmer ever made in his life? It was the biggest mistake he made in his eternity. That he went into the next world unprepared completely to face this God that's going to determine where he lives. Malcolm Forbes, I don't know how many of you know him. Anybody know his famous quote? He that has the most toys when he dies wins. Okay? Now I always wondered, wins what? Malcolm Forbes died not too long ago. And now he knows. Now he knows. Jesus does not want us to go afar from what God wants us to do. That the farmer has worked hard. He's an honest man. He's just doing the best that he knows how to do. But then he faces this one thing that he's not ready for, and that's eternity. He's not ready to face this God because he has gone away from God's will. The one thing that I know is that possessions, money, changes us. All of us. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. Okay? Again, my sons and I'm very concerned that my boys keep a proper view of what this life is really all about. And I would say to Danny something about how money changes us. And he says, "You're right, Dad. I've noticed that." Okay, Danny and Brooke together make very good money. He's risen up in this company, and he will talk to me about when he gets a certain amount of money in the bank, he doesn't want it to go below there. It used to be $1,000, Dad. Now it's $2,000. That they're worried if it goes under $2,000. And see how it changed him? And I keep talking with him, be careful, be careful. The rich young ruler, that's why Jesus says to him, sell all your possessions. Because that's what's blocking you, that's what's going to cost you. Wouldn't it be a shame if a $20 bill cost me my eternity? Wouldn't it be a shame that this piece of paper would end up causing me to walk away from God? I've shared with you before that when my father passed away, there was 8 of us kids, and when Dad passed away, there was a big argument among us children, the 4 youngest against the 4 oldest, because the 4 oldest got 1 cent more than we did. And I have been after my brother Bob for years. I want that half penny that was due me. They got X amount of dollars and 34 cents. We got X amount of dollars and 33 cents. And it just split our family. Just kidding. Just kidding. But I still give Bob a hard time. He wanted to give me the whole penny. And I said, no, 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 we can't do that. This has to be even. It's got to be even. God always, I found, works on me in those areas that I want to preach on. Because the other night, it was Thursday night, I think, that I was wrapping up what I was going to preach on this morning. I got a phone call from a family that lives in an area where their water is not drinkable. They can use it to shower in and things like that, but they can't drink the water. And there's 4 of them, a man, his wife, and 2 children, and they are completely out of water. And they asked, Joe, do you have some money that we can buy some water? And I said, well, how much do you need? And they said, oh, $40 to get us through. And I stood for a second, I thought, now do I have $40 to give to these people for water? And it wasn't but a few seconds, my answer was, Joe, you idiot, of course you do. Of course you do. Why would you even have to stop and think about that? And then there was a voice that came from God that says, you better. You better. I had a few things I thought I needed to get at Walmart. I didn't get them. This is Sunday. That was Thursday. I'm still fine. I'm still fine. They needed water. They needed milk to live on, and I had to hesitate whether I wanted to let go of $40 to help them or not. And after I helped them, you know what I did? I got on my knees and I said, God, forgive me that I even questioned that I even thought for a moment that I needed those things worse than these people needed what they absolutely had to have. You see, giving someone else's money is okay. Mine, we need to think about that. You know, there's a story I come across of a man that was in a weight room, and he was doing the weights, and the phone rang, the cell phone rang, he picked it up, and on the other end, a lady says, honey, I found this necklace that I think is just beautiful, just beautiful. And I put it on a credit card. It was only $15,000. Is that okay? And her husband says, yeah, that's fine. No problem. Well, honey, when I was getting the necklace, I found this fur coat. And it looked so good together. I bought the fur coat. It was just $19,000. I put it on another credit card. Is that okay? And the guy on the phone says, yeah, I don't care. No, no problem. Well, honey, when I was coming home, I went by this car lot, and there's this new Mercedes, $150,000. And boy, it was the car that I needed with this fur coat and the necklace. Is that okay? Yes, I don't care. No problem. Well, honey, one more thing. I put a down payment on a new house, $1.5 million. We got a really good deal on it. What do you think? The man says, that's fine, no problem. Well, thank you, honey. She hangs up. The guy stands up and says, anybody know whose phone this is? When it's somebody else's money, it's okay. When it's mine, well, wait a minute. We need to think this over a little bit because I might need this for something. And that's when I believe we need to get down on our knees and say, God, forgive us. Jesus understands that. Life is more than our possessions. The same question comes down that Jesus says to the farmer here. You're going to die right now. Who's going to get all this stuff? Who's it going to go to? We had a family in Rossville. The grandfather lived just a couple doors down from us. He built his, it was a canning company, and he had a cattle farm, and he had built this up to it was the business in Rossville at that time. And then Louis, the grandfather, passed away, and his son, Richard, took over the business and did okay with it. It went all right. And then Richard retired, and he passed away, and his son, Steve, took over, and it was bankrupt in 5 years. So, Louis, you spent your whole life on what? What a shame. What a shame. Solomon, king of Israel, the greatest king. He had all the wealth you could think of. You know, the Queen of Sheba comes to look at the palace and temple, and what does she say to Solomon? I've heard all of this, but I haven't heard a half of what you got here. All the gold, everything. Solomon dies. How many of you know the story? Rehoboam and Jeroboam, his 2 sons. get into it, split the kingdom, and everything just completely falls apart. So Solomon, who gets all this stuff? Okay? Who gets all this stuff? Our life is more than what we possess, I hope. And what Jesus is saying to us, the first section here, folks, is the fact that people of the kingdom don't live like this. It's not a suggestion that he has given us. He is saying if you are a believer in God, if you're a part of his kingdom, if you're a Christian, you don't live like this. Your priority is the kingdom of God. And God supplies what you have. He has promised us that. That's the first lesson that he wants us to know. The second one is probably going to hit us a little bit closer. He is going to tell us in this that we don't live a life of anxiety. How many worriers do we have here? How many of you are lying by not raising your hand? No. We have a tendency to do that, don't we? One of the things that I've learned, though, is that we spend most of our time worrying about things we cannot control. Who is it? Where's Ron Kissack? Oh, he's Ron up here. He's going to get you in trouble, me too. Ron says, Joe, who do you think is going to win the Super Bowl? And my response was what? I don't care. I'm kind of toward the Ravens. Don't throw his name. Gosh, what's his name? The linebacker. Ray Lewis. I couldn't think of Ray. Ray Lewis is retiring from the Ravens. Okay? Can anybody tell me something else about Ray Lewis? I know Randy can. Bob, can what, Bob?
He's in the murder deal.
Yeah, he's in a murder deal, but he was found innocent. Yeah. Whatever we think about that. And see, that's the one thing that always comes to my mind with Ray Lewis. It was never clear what happened there. But the one thing I do know now is that Ray Lewis is a very outspoken Christian man. Very much so. He makes very little bones about his faith. So I kind of like the Ravens to win, but don't anybody soak my windows or break my car windows if you like the 49ers. Because ultimately what I'm getting at is that no matter who wins this game tomorrow morning, it has no effect upon my life whatsoever. I have no influence over the outcome. So I don't get involved in things where I don't have some kind of part of what's going to happen here. Okay? The best player for either team could break his leg the first play and the whole thing gets changed. I'm not going to get into that. So I have learned through the years that I don't worry. There's concerns that I have, but I know I come to a point where I can't control this. Do I worry about my boys when they live away from me? No, I'm concerned about them. I pray for them. I can't do anything about what's going on in their life. I can react to it. And Jesus wants us to know that. Read with me here, beginning in verse 22. Then Jesus said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. Baltimore? No, I'm just kidding. See, even Jesus likes the ravens. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn. That is part that always bothers me. Yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable are you than birds? Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life? In fact, science has proven what to us? It shortens my life. Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the lilies grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possession and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that you will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief can come near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Let's look at this last section here. First of all, that we will not live a life of anxiety. Our life pulls us in a lot of different directions, doesn't it? I mean, if you're not going through a particular struggle that right now you're going to, or you're just going through one, and we get in a spot where we have to decide what really is important. What really is important in life? And that's where Jesus wants us to focus. Because I don't care who you are, what you go through in life, ultimately all that's going to matter is what your relationship with Jesus is when you take the last breath. That's all that's going to matter. I remember having that conversation with my dad when my mom died. She was within moments of dying, and we were standing at the back porch. This has been many, many years ago. And I said, Dad, it doesn't matter what clothes Mom wore, what house you lived in, what car you drove. Any of that doesn't matter. All that matters at this moment is what her relationship with Jesus is. Is she going to go to heaven when she dies? And folks, I've learned if that's all that matters at the time of my death, then that's all that can matter in the time of my life. That's all that matters. Because ultimately that's what it all comes down to. So why worry? We can choose to worry, or we can choose to worship. Now, worship, I'm not talking about in this building and for an hour and a half, whatever. I'm talking about the way I live my life. That everything I do is an act of worship to God. So I can choose to live that way, or I can choose to be afraid. You know, when we used to go down to Kansas City and go to the NASCAR races before the grandchildren came along, which this is far greater than any NASCAR race, I can tell you that. But people said, well, all these people want to be together. Aren't you afraid somebody might have a bomb? I mean, you're talking about 70, 80,000 people. And my response is the possibility is there, but I'm not going to live my life in fear. I'm not going to stay inside because I'm afraid what might happen if I step outside. My goodness, we see that all over, don't we? If we were to react in the fear that is in our world today, we wouldn't go anywhere. But we can't live our life like that. Don't be afraid, Jesus says. My Father's pleasure was to give you the kingdom. That's what's going to matter. That I'm a part of that kingdom, that worrying doesn't really do anything for us because we cannot control it, but God can. And God does, no matter what. He is on the throne. He's in control. Don't understand sometimes why He does the things that He does, but the one thing I know is I can trust Him. He's doing what's right. He's doing what's best. He's going to work this out. And one day, we're going to be able to look back and see exactly what He was doing, to see that He knew exactly the right things to do. What are we going to worry about? That when I worry about, am I saying to God, you're not big enough to handle my problems? Or God can handle this part of this, so I've got to take it over? We worry about tomorrow, and we miss the opportunities of today. You see, today is the tomorrow that we worried about yesterday. And here we are. Here we are. Well, the third thing that Jesus says to us, that He doesn't want us to live a life of absurdity. Now, I know you folks well enough to know that some of you are absurd. Not mentioning any names. I still have a headache from yesterday. I believe I have a concussion. I'll tell you about that later. Folks, what's the sense of living life and flunking it? What sense does that make? Well, however many years that you live, what's the sense of living life and coming to the end and flunking it? I have been in hospital rooms with people that have sat there and talked to me about their life and said, Joe, I really don't have anything in my life that I've done. Nothing I can look at. Where's God in your life? I've never had time for God. I've not done anything. What's the sense of that? It makes no sense to me whatsoever. That we know this time is coming. That's the absurdity. Do we live our life on a dead-end street? I remember coming back from Joplin, Missouri one time and turned off to go around St. Louis, turned off the wrong place, ended up in the wrong place. Have you ever been in St. Charles, Missouri? Have you ever been in St. Charles, Missouri at 2 in the morning? Not the place to be. Okay? By the time I got about 6 blocks off Interstate 44, there were about 6 or 8 guys standing on the street corner saying my car looked pretty nice. So we did an about face and got out in a hurry. What's the sense of living life that way? That we're on a dead-end street. There is no hope, there is no way to go, that we're going to come to the end here, and that's going to be the end, period. What sense does that make, to live on a dead-end street? That's what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about. In fact, I have a book about Ecclesiastes that you read about living life on a dead-end street. What some seem to be pursuing in life is absolutely absurd. Absolutely. You just look at it. What? Why? What is the benefit? How is life going to be improved by the direction that they're trying to go? If you've worked on a computer, there are times that you've looked at that computer screen just like that. Now, I've become a little smarter, and I've gone to another type of computer that Danny put me in touch with, and I really don't have these problems anymore. But there were times I'd sit in the office, and I'd work on something for 2 hours, and all at once, the screen freezes. And you sit there and say, boy, I wish I would have saved that. 2 hours for nothing. 2 hours just to push the button or unplug it and start all over again. What's the sense of living a life that way? That's absurd, isn't it? That's absurd, and that's what Jesus is talking about here. That he wants us to go for what is right and what is good. He is saying to us that chasing worldly things is absolutely absurd. Not only is it foolish, it's futile. Absolutely futile. Again, Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes talks about chasing the wind. And what he's getting at is trying to find happiness in the things of this world that you try to grab a hold of and you just can't quite get a hold of it. We just can't. He talks about the sand that drifts through and sifts through our hands because we just can't hold on to it. That we scurry around about material things. And you know what Jesus says? That's what the pagans do. The people of the kingdom don't go around after material things. The people of the kingdom don't worry about things they can't control. The people of the kingdom don't live their life foolishly or full of futility as they live there. Yet that's the essence of life with many. What sense does it make? You're eventually going to wreck. I have seen this picture, for the most part, 4 different times in my life. The one that I remember the best, I was doing a wedding down in Indianapolis. I was just outside of Vincennes, Indiana. I decided to go down there with the new interstate exchange they have. And as I go around this curve, here's this young lady, and nothing against young ladies, but being a young guy, and she's coming right at me. And she continues to go right at me. And I'm off in the ditch, and she still misses me about that far. And as she goes by, you know what I see her doing? 4 times I've almost been hit head on. Okay? And all I could think of was the next guy behind me. I made it by her. But eventually, what is this young lady going to do? She's going to wreck. And the wreck will be very serious. Jesus said that if we are going after the things that he mentioned here that people in the kingdom don't go after, eventually we're going to wreck. Eventually our life is just going to shatter. And then what? That's what Jesus is concerned about. I saw this picture. I had to put it up there. Honk if you love Jesus, text while driving if you want to meet him. Right? Dangerous thing. Yet I see people all over this community on their phones. Fortunately, just going 25 miles an hour. Last night on the slick roads going home, there was a lady, I don't know where she was from, whether she was unfamiliar, but she's texting, I can see through her back window, and she comes up to Locust and 3rd Street, and you know what she does? She slams on the brakes to stop. There's no stop sign there, and here I am back here thinking, oh boy. Okay. Fortunately, nothing happened, but eventually it's going to. You see, Jesus flies in the face of what many say is essential. That we have watered this down and tried to figure out some other explanation that Jesus didn't really mean that. But what Jesus is saying folks, is that people that belong to the kingdom don't have the same value system as the pagans do. They don't go after the same things that the pagans do. Our home is where? In heaven. Philippians. Our citizenship is there. So, do we need certain physical things? Absolutely we do. That's not, don't make this being ridiculous. Absolutely we do. But people of the kingdom don't pursue those things. They don't make it their goal to have as much as I can at the end of my life. I don't know what for. The values of the people of the kingdom are different than the values of the pagans. I was working on this. How many of you recognize that picture? I just wondered. Probably not a movie most of us would watch. It's called Batman Begins. Kristen Bale. I don't even know what the lady's name is. But I'm sitting there working on the sermon, and the other show I was kind of paying attention to went off, and this came on. So I'm just sitting there, and I'm not paying any attention, and the story is that he becomes Batman. Hope I didn't. The first one, I guess. I don't even know that to be true. Okay? But he goes away to find himself. His dad is very rich, this big company, but he goes away to find himself, and he comes back, and this young lady is a lady he knew much younger. I don't know, I never quite gathered whether it was his sister or just some friend that he had, but he gets out of this car, and she is standing there, and they recognize each other, and they have this discussion. And she makes some remark to him, and he says, I'm still the same guy way underneath. And she says, Bruce Wayne, of course, his name, Bruce, you may still be the same guy underneath, but what you do will define you. Even in the worst of movies, we can find those great lines that come out that make you stop and think. You can say you believe all you want to, but what you do is going to define whether you're a Christian or not, folks. You can say that you have this faith, but if you don't obey, if you don't step out and perform the way the people of the kingdom are to live, it's what you do that's going to define who you are. We can talk, but do we obey? We can say the right words, but do we do those things in which God has told us He wants to do? To seek the kingdom, is that the priority of my life? And see, that answer to that question has eternal consequences. And finally, on a positive note, just for a moment here, to live a life of assurance. That's the life of the people of the kingdom. God's got this in control. He's got this figured out. He's going to take care of those things that we need. He will. He's promised us that. And whether I believe Him or not becomes the key to this whole thing. Don't be afraid of life, Jesus says. The term, don't be afraid or fear not, is found in the Bible how many times, you know? 365 times. I think that's interesting. How many days in a year if it's not leap year? Okay. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You can live this life of assurance. That's the key word to the kingdom, is assurance. It becomes a very critical issue in life, Jesus says, that wherever my heart is, that's where my treasure is. Is my heart in this world? That's where I'm going to have my treasure. Is my heart in another world? That's where I want to have my treasure. That's what the reward I want. That's what I'm looking for, to be able. When I focus on the wrong things, we set ourselves up for failure. Period. There was a young man that told his father one day that his name was Nathan. He said, Dad, I've decided I'm going to go to school and become a stockbroker. And then I'm going to work in the stock market. I'm going to become a millionaire. And by the time I'm 30, I'm going to be able to retire and move to the Bahamas. His dad said, that may be true, but I will be very sad that you have failed so badly in life. That's what Dad's saying. It's not about this. It's about Him. It's about God, about life. Remember the dotcom kids, they called them years ago? There was a whole bunch of young people that did this very thing, and by the time they were 30, they had made their millions and millions and millions, and you know what the most popular thing among those young people were? Do you remember? Suicide. Billionaires at 30, 35 years old, and over half of them committed suicide. Why? Because they found no reason to keep living. Wow. I have a book by Anthony Campolo. Excellent book. It's not necessarily a religious book, but it's called Waking Up from the American Dream. And his final say is the American dream really is a nightmare that we've got ourselves into, pursuing those things that are absolutely of no value whatsoever. Seek the kingdom, Jesus says. That's the remedy to worry, to fear. The promise and the assurance of God, that is the goal here. I have this quote I'll put up just for a second. We need to go. A.W. Tozer, I don't know if you know who that is. He's a gentleman that lived many years ago. Some of the greatest, I'm trying to think what that book was, In His Glory. It's a devotional book. He's one of the great writers of years ago. And you can read what he has there. Happy is the man who is too busy to worry by day and too sleepy to worry at night. If only he would stop lamenting and look up. God is here. Christ is risen. The Spirit has been poured out from on high. All this we know as theological truth. It remains for us to turn into a joyous spiritual experience. We would say what? We've got in the head knowledge, we've got to get in the heart knowledge. We've got to take this truth and change it to a life-changing experience for us, that we know that God is here and He's going to take care of us. There was a baby father and mother that volunteered for the nursery at their church. And they had one little boy one time that they just could not get him to relax. He just cried and cried and cried. So finally the father is walking around with him saying, "It's okay, little baby, I've got you. It's okay, you're safe." And that night there was a particular situation in his life that he was worried about, and his wife rolled over and said, "It's okay. God's got you. Remember what you just said to that little baby? That he can relax. He can be rest assured because you had him in your arms. And so does Jesus have us in our arms. Believe it or not. Believe it or not. And my God will give me what I need as far as my life is concerned." Well, how radical Jesus' teaching is. The truth is that the citizens of the kingdom don't live like the pagans do. That's the whole thing here. We don't have the same values. We don't enjoy the same things. We don't seek for the same things because our value system is completely different. Anybody know what the worst food to eat is? I just got an email last week that listed the 7 worst foods that you can eat. I won't go through all of them. The top 2, one is fast foods, which I think we're all aware of that. But I become very, very upset because the worst food you can eat is pizza? No, somebody's got to be mistaken about that. Remember the commercials about how it had all the different food groups in it? And how it was really good for you? And now they decided the worst possible food that you can eat is pizza. And I was so upset at that I deleted the email. Now, they're right. They're right. If you look at the explanation, they're right. But I like pizza. So I just X'd it out. Georgia, done with it. Do we do that to God? I like this part of the Bible just fine, but over here I don't like what it says about that, so I'm just going to exit. I'm just going to push it away. I remember a king named Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim. Found in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah writes this prophecy. And it finally gets back to Jehoiakim. I'll give you the short version. And Jehoiakim reads it. And there are parts of it he doesn't like. So he takes a knife out and he starts cutting it out. And finally he takes the whole scroll and throws it into the fire. He doesn't want to hear that. So Jeremiah, Baruch, the prophet, the writer for Jeremiah, goes back to Jeremiah and says, he burned it. So Jeremiah goes back to God and says, Jehoiakim burnt the whole scroll. And you know what God says? We're going to write it down again. But at the bottom here, we're putting a little extra about Jehoiakim. We can choose to just look at passages of the Bible and decide we're not even going to think about that part. We like this. We're doing this, but we're not doing that, so we're just going to disregard that part. It's not going to go well. Not going to go well at all. The question that we must challenge ourselves, there's always the bigger picture. The first question is, am I living my life based on Bible principles? That's the first thing that I've got to look at. Am I? Is that what I'm trying to allow God to change me so I'm living by these principles? The second one, are my priorities in my life the same priorities of Jesus? See, that's what determines if I'm part of the kingdom. There was a young man and an older man that were having this conversation about the future. And the young man says, well, I'm going to go learn a trade. And then, the old man says, well, I'm going to set up a business. And then, the old man says, well, I'm going to make a fortune, the young man says. And then the old man says, and then? He said, well, I suppose I'll grow old and retire and live on my money. And then? Well, he thought for a moment, I suppose that someday I'll die. And the man says, and then what? When we come to the end of this life, and we've done all the things the world says that we're supposed to do, not necessarily God, then what, folks? Then what? Our hymn of invitation is hymn number 410 in our hymnal. Cleanse me. That's what we need for God to do now, is to cleanse us, not just one time, but that we might allow Him to work in us, to change us, to search us, and see that our priorities aren't what they ought to be. Our principles are not what God intended for us to be. That we want Him to cleanse us and make us who He wants us to be. Hymn number 410, let's stand together.